Hello, everyone. I'm Peter Freer. I am founder and CEO of Play Attention. Thank you for being here. I started this journey about 30 years ago. I was a master's level educator with students, autistic students, ADHD students, and my specialty areas were physics, computer programming, computer science, mathematics, and so forth. And I decided, since there were such limited options for those students at that time, that I would create a program that would help them. And that is where Play Attention came into being. I researched what NASA was doing and found that they were using neurotechnology to train students or their pilots and astronauts levels of performance in states of hyperarousal when they were overly excited and states of hypoarousal when they were bored. I enhanced that, and we were the first at that time to see that ADHD and autism were linked, and that this thing called executive function was crucial to understanding what and how to work with people to increase their performance. So I'm delighted to present rejection sensitive dysphoria, ADHD, and autism today. And I hope that you'll learn a lot from this presentation. The theme generally is going to be about learning and change, learning and change, understanding and change. So in order to do that, I have to have your attention. And one of the reasons that we miss a lot nowadays is because we have a computer hooked to our hand, our cell phone. So I would encourage you, if you're not viewing this on a cell phone, turn the cell phone off or at least mute it. If you're on your computer or tablet, then just turn off your interruptions, texts or messaging and things like that. I just like this as a conversation between friends, because when we're talking with friends, we tend to learn a lot more and we listen a lot more closely. When we're going through the webinar today, I like to make things as concrete as possible, because if things are concrete and not just left as concepts, then we understand much more. So when we are doing this, when we're going through the webinar, we're going to define what rejection actually is and naming rejection, because if we name it and understand it, it becomes less of a concept and more understandable, more material that would resonate within me. And that's how we will proceed through the webinar. We'll talk about how RSD affects our lives, what the causes are, RSD and executive function, which is they're incredibly closely tied. How do we get RSD diagnosed? And then our options to be able to reduce RSD. We are recording this webinar, so it should be available by tomorrow. We'll have it up and a link for you. So if you miss it or if you have to leave early, we'll have it up for you tomorrow. Let's go ahead and define what rejection is. And sometimes we have a very light rejection, which is not too hard to bear. For example, my child comes in and I've cooked meatloaf, and the child says, "I hate your meatloaf. I'm not eating that." Well, I just have been rejected. That's rather a light rejection. It's not going to break my heart. I understand they don't like it. Too bad they're not going to get anything else, but that's what the story is then. But then we have number two here, the spurning of a person's affections. And I remember being rejected, was in love with the person, and she just outright after a while said, "I'm not going to stay here. I'm not doing this." And at that point, the impact is so much deeper. When we're talking about rejection sensitive dysphoria, RSD, as I'll term it throughout most of the rest of the webinar, we're talking about the intense feeling that happens, especially when we're autistic or have ADHD. And we'll talk about not only what it feels like, but how it's more intense and what causes that as well. So let's talk a little bit about this word dysphoria. It's rather an odd word we don't commonly use in everyday language, but in psychiatry, it's this state of unease, discomfort, internally uncomfortable. It's derived, and this second part here is incredibly enlightening when you look at it. It's derived from the Greek word meaning hard to bear, onerous. It's equated with a feeling of pain or discomfort. So this is, bear with me as you hear this, because as we move forward, you're going to actually understand why this is used. This dysphoria is used as if not only as this feeling of general unease and dissatisfaction with life, but as this hard to bear, this feeling of pain and discomfort. I think you'll be enlightened by where that actually arises. And naming rejection. Remember, I said this, the theme to this entire webinar is about change, understanding, and change. The more we understand, the more we wish to change. And we have an internationally based audience here today, all over the globe. But I would wager that the majority of you are here because you are not happy. You either have a relationship with someone who's got RSD, or you have it yourself, you have ADHD, and you want to make change. So I would ask right now, is that why? Raise your hand if that's why you are here. Well, that's the vast majority of us. Thank you. Yeah, we want to understand. So I'm not going to just talk about what it is. I want to make it concrete so that we understand what our options are to understand and then make change. Now, there are terms here that we have used in, I've got a good list. Refusal, we've already talked about. Here's a biblical one, forsaking. My friend forsake me and pushed me out, moved away. They rejected me. These are ways of saying it: ignoring, snubbing, non-acceptance. But you have my meatloaf example from earlier on. Nope, not eating that. That's a rejection. And there's the painful one, a kick in the teeth. Man, that was a kick in the teeth. But there is also a modern one here as well. If you look in the last column on the lower right-hand side, you see ghosting, which is rejection, right? They reject my voicemail and cell calls. They reject my texts. They reject my messages. So rejection takes a variety of forms. When we understand the words and how they're used in the context, we have a better understanding of RSD, and this will progress. So starting at the very basis and moving upward from there. How does this affect our lives? How does RSD affect our lives? If we're typical ADHD or autistic, one of the ways that we try to compensate for being emotionally sensitive, deeply sensitive, rejection sensitive. I do not want to be rejected internally. There's that, what we initially called dysphoria, that cognitive unease, that dissatisfaction, that is equated with pain, the same sensory system in the brain that equates it with actual physical pain. So what do we do? Here's how it affects us generally. If we're ADHD, autistic as well, we compensate by overworking. I don't want to feel rejection, so I will do everything in my power to please everyone. I will do my best to overwork, and I'll make promises that I cannot keep. Because if you look at bullet point number 2, I'll set standards that can't be met. I will set them so high, and in my mind, I will strive for them. I seldom ever reach them, but in order to not feel rejected or be disliked by people, I just set standards way above the bar, and I try to do this so that everyone will like me. But when I don't meet those standards, they begin to greatly dislike me and find me annoying. And I also will avoid situations where I might get rejected. I won't go out to dinner with the work crew because no one likes me. They're not going to like me. I know they're not going to like me at dinner time. I'm just not going. I'll avoid those situations. I'll overreact. And there is a reason for this. When I have RSD, many times I will have incredibly intense emotional outbursts or anger, displays of anger. And there is a reason for this as well. And we'll move into it as we go forward. But at this point, I just want to ask everyone to raise hands if this is starting to resonate, if you recognize these patterns within people that either you work with, you live with, yourself, your children, relationships. Okay, we're on the same page then, because remember, we're talking as friends here and we're sharing things. And I definitely want you to understand where we're headed and that we can understand the way that the working of RSD, ADHD, and the relationship to autism and so forth, how they're all interrelated and how we can actually cause change. Definitely, when we have the problem of RSD, we also internally get more uncomfortable because it creates a certain pattern internally. And I hope this also resonates with you, that I have a personal feeling of failure and I set standards that are too high for myself, but then I also know I haven't met the standards the other people expect of me. This results in my withdrawal and anxiety. I withdraw from social events. I withdraw socially, period. I stay to myself. And then eventually, I may even be afraid. I may have developed a fear of social interaction because I don't want to be embarrassed. Obviously, all of this leads to decreased self-esteem. And then you can see this in this one slide, you see this downward spiral. And in the last bullet point here, sometimes I actually ideate. I think about hurting myself. You probably have seen this as well. And I want to implore you right now, if you are thinking about this, if you are thinking about hurting yourself, if you have any inclination toward this at this point, and maybe some of you are here because of that. I'm not going to make you identify yourselves. I'm not going to ask you to, but I'm going to implore you, if you are thinking like that, stop the webinar now and dial 988. In the United States, 988 is a hotline where someone will talk to you and help you and help you learn to calm down and work through life. So again, if you are thinking about in any way hurting yourself at this point, leave the webinar now and then go ahead and call 988 in the United States. There are other people here from other areas of the world, and each one of those codes is different, but I implore you to do the same thing. Call, leave, and call. There is no reason that you should hurt yourself over this. You do have a way to change. There is a way to understand the way that you're living now and to make change. I do want you to understand that, but do not stay here if you are ideating about that. One of the panelists told me that this is the same number for Canada as well. Thank you very much, Kelly. RSD can affect my relationships with my family and my friends, my romantic partner. When I think about it so much and I develop that veil of RSD, that veil prevents me from going out into social events, and I develop a fear, and I examine that fear through my veil of RSD. Everything looks like rejection at that point. I have low self-esteem. Everyone's just rejecting me. They don't like me. And then when I have that veil, even my closest romantic partner, my spouse, my, better half, whatever you want to call it, if I'm viewing them through that veil, I find that everything that they say to me looks like a rejection. Everything. And they are confused. What are you talking about? I'm not rejecting what you said. I'm just saying, let's think about it this way. But to you, it's all about rejection. and you cannot move past it. And this is incredibly uncomfortable for both parties. And oftentimes the other party just doesn't know how to manage it. They'll stay with you for a long time, but they just are unhappy. You're unhappy. You do not have to live like that. Absolutely do not have to. But you can also see the last part of the second sentence here is that we can actually turn that into a self-fulfilling prophecy. In other words, if I keep repeating over and over and looking through the veil of rejection, I actually am creating a future full of rejection. I am creating my own problem. I will have a self-fulfilling prophecy. I'm going to just experience rejection. And all of a sudden, I am actually creating the environment for it. Not something we have to do. It's definitely not something we have to do. Most people who have autism or ADHD are also incredibly sensitive to what other people say about them. Bullying is a form of rejection, isn't it? Being told you're an idiot, no one likes you, you're ugly, they tell you all kinds of things. And thanks to the internet, the internet, and as my brother puts it, it is the truck stop restroom wall where anybody can scribble anything, and it's there forever. And that's what it's turned into in many cases, especially with social media. Remember when you were a child, when I was a child, if I was rejected or bullied, it was for a few seconds at school, and that's it. Now, bullying and rejection can be 24/7, 365 days a year. And this is important to realize that if we are already sensitive about it, and then it is compounded by the fact that I cannot escape it, the problem gets very serious. And that's where we talked about ideation, where many children even think about hurting themselves now because of this, because of that rejection that they're getting, the bullying that they're getting, which is just another form of rejection. It's harsh form, and they can't take it. And so they start thinking about ways they can get out, and they get away from being injured, from that dysphoria, the discomfort, the unease, and the actual physical pain that it causes them. Now, it does have a spectrum. Some feel it more than others. In extreme cases, in which you see a lot, there are emotional outbursts and a lot of withdrawal. Some are lighter cases, but all of this is relevant to understanding what RSD is. Now, this is interesting. These stats from WebMD are incredibly interesting. Up to 99% of teens and adults with ADHD are more sensitive than usual to rejection. And there is a reason for this. I'll go into in more detail in just a moment. 1 out of 3 of these people say it's the hardest part of living with ADHD. Now, autism was not included in this statement, but I would guarantee you autism is right up there with this, the same. So why is it that we feel more sensitivity than a neurotypical? And there is a reason for it, and we'll discuss it. And it's because of the way that we, number one, our internal mechanism, and number two, how we process that. So let's talk about how we process things just a little bit and our internal mechanism. Does everybody see all of these dots on the screen? If you look at them just in a cursory overview, they look random. Let's now take a little bit deeper look at the dots on the screen. Does anyone here see the pattern? Raise your hand if you see the patterns that are in there. Excellent. Yeah, there are a lot of patterns. You see the pattern of straight line of green large dots? Do you see the pattern of blue dots? Do you see the pattern of red dots and orange dots as they go across the screen? You'll start seeing many different patterns in here. Now, the brain has developed throughout history for hundreds of thousands of years, if not millions of years. The brain has developed to recognize patterns. But why? What's the need for it? Well, fundamentally, when we are trying to survive, if we recognize patterns, then that gave us a way to survive, right? We could see patterns that may cause us harm. And if we could see those patterns, we could prevent them from happening or run away from them. See it? Run away or fight them. We could also see patterns that would promote our survival. I could recognize seasons like the spring and summer where there would be abundance. And I could recognize seasons like deep fall and winter in which there was not an abundance of things for us to survive. So just being able to recognize these patterns helps us, and sometimes it scares us a little bit, but it does help us stay alive, right? And that's the way the brain thrives in a safe environment. If we have security and safety, the brain functions quite well. When we are scared, frightened, insecure, the brain does not work as well. So that's why we have these patterns of thought. And that's also what happens in RSD. So I do want to talk about this relationship to thought patterns and RSD, because who we are, right, our content, the consciousness, who we are, everything that I've built to be me, which is speaking English, the English language right now in North America, is formed about where I grew up, when I grew up, who my parents were. All of this is learned behavior. And these are recorded. These instances where I spoke to my parents, I learned from teachers, are all recordings in the brain. They're either pictures or audio or smells or videos in my brain. And this makes up who I am. Can I modify those? You bet. I can modify those. Matter of fact, oftentimes memories will modify themselves. Memories are not incredibly accurate over years, but we can make changes to them. That is who I am. That's where all of the pattern recognitions come. It teaches me things, and I learn a lot from them, and then I'm storing them in my brain. But what happens when I keep playing tapes that are harmful in my brain? It changes the programming in my brain. If we think of the brain as a computer, and I constantly repeat things to myself, I'm not going out there. They're going to just reject me. I'm afraid of going out. They're always bullying me. Then it reprograms the brain. Just this language, this internal repetition of language, reprograms the brain. It's quite simple. We're not aware of it. I'm going to go into that. That's called time travel. And I bet you didn't know we were all time travelers. I'm going to go into that in detail a little bit further along. We are all time travelers in a way, and it's not necessarily a healthy way, but I'll talk to you about that in a moment. By doing this, I am changing the program in my brain, especially if I have RSD. If I'm extraordinarily sensitive to rejection, then it reshapes my entire programming. If I have ADHD, it reshapes my entire programming. If I'm autistic, it reshapes my programming. We'll talk about this a little bit more. What are the causes of it? Well, particularly if just RSD, no one knows. This is relatively new. And so there's been very little research on it. If you have it and you have incredible outbursts and you feel incredibly rejected and you feel internally, like you equate it with pain, like the pain of being injured, then you know you have it. So we understand quite seriously that it's a real thing, but there hasn't been much research on it, and it's not even in the diagnostic, the DSM. It's not in the diagnostic statistical manual at all. We do know, though, that in an autistic brain, well, it's particularly ADHD. I'm not going to equate autism with this particular fact, but with ADHD brains, their growth and development is delayed by up to 2 or 3 years. So mechanisms that help us filter out rejection, be able to cope with it, put the brakes on feeling deeply rejected, are either not there or they're in a weak form. They're not incredibly developed. And this is because the ADHD brain develops more slowly. And so the skills necessary to put the brakes on, particularly in the frontal lobes, which is called executive function, are not there. So one of the things that will help you as a parent, we have many parents here today, one of the things that will help you is that if your child is giving you incredible outbursts that seem just totally out of place, not appropriate for that particular incident. They got pushed out of the way at the water fountain at school and they exploded on the other person, or just laid down and cried and wailed. And you go, why in the heck is this happening? I don't understand this. Just understand that if they're ADHD or if they have a developmental delay, the brain just does not have the cognitive skills to slow that roll down. And yell as you want, punish as you may, talking to them will not give them those skills. So we have to understand, once we understand this, we can at least ourselves learn how to adjust to it. If you're dealing with someone who has RSD and they're your spouse or your boyfriend, your girlfriend, whatever, and you're encountering this, you can talk to them all you want. That mechanism, they don't have control over. The networks that are required to do this are not in place. And if the networks are not in place, there's no amount of cajoling, team spirit kind of thing that's going to change that. You actually have to work on it. And I'll go into that in more detail. Remember, when I talked about dysphoria earlier, and I've talked about it several slides, that it came from the Greek word that also meant physical pain. So the rejection actually, in this case, is in this network in the brain that is very, very similar to physical pain. And I'll describe this for you in just a moment. Gene changes could be the way that RSD is passed down in families. And if you have serious trauma, like abuse and so forth, TBI, it could exacerbate it. It's not going to cause it, but it could exacerbate the symptoms. So when I do have ADHD or autism, then the network in my nervous system that typically can put the brakes on overreacts to these things from the outside world. It may cause this second segment down here. It may cause an emotional reaction that's much more extreme than usual. This could be in adults, and it could be in children as well. Remember, the brake mechanism is not there, and I'll go into that in more detail in a moment. ADHD researchers estimate by the age of 12, and this is incredibly salient, children with ADHD get 20,000 more negative messages about themselves than other kids their age. And this we can, again, attribute to having a cell phone in our hands or a tablet or a computer. We just can be bombarded 24/7, 365 days a year. So remember when you possibly, if you're over 50 years old, when you were a child, you got a note at school from you, I don't like you. You're an idiot. Or they came up and they pushed you or just said something to you. And that was pretty much the end of it. But now it doesn't leave. And you can see that bombarding someone with this type of language, it's the same thing marketers use. If marketers can get hold of you and they can get you to experience something, marketers, politicians, you name it, they reuse it. If I can let you hear it enough, you will believe it. And so being told you're just lazy, you're dumb, I don't want to be around you, I'm rejecting you, you don't, just go somewhere else, this kind of thing. Then you begin internally, you're believing it. It's part of the way you are now made up. It changes the programming in your brain. And this is where executive function becomes incredibly important. For those of you who understand what executive function is, please bear with me. But in the frontal lobes, and it's not entirely in the frontal lobes. The frontal lobes are where everyone feels that it's governed, but it involves many regions of the brain. But it's a certain set of cognitive skills that one has to have to function well. I have to have good attention, which gives me the ability to reason out a problem, to make good judgments, to plan, to problem solve, to have good organization, and to have good emotional regulation. So if I am being rejected, I have a way to put the brakes on that. Impulse control as well, mental flexibility, self-monitoring. All of this, the emotion regulation, and then my ability to control my outbursts, my impulses, is incredibly related to this. That is all what executive function is. It's our ability to regulate these things, self-regulate. But remember, if we have RSD and ADHD particularly, the regulatory governance of the brain is either not in place as it should be or very weak. And this is the major problem here. So if we understand what the problem is, it can help us in shaping our child or our students or our clients' behaviors. It can also help us understand, if we have it, it can help us understand how this mechanism works. And if we remember, if we understand fully, then we can encompass change, right? That is what we're talking about today. So I'm going to go through the mechanism in the brain that actually helps us regulate and actually is responsible for how we respond. In the brain, we have a network that is particularly assigned to be able to protect us from frightening things. Now you can see the amygdala here, that big orange piece in the center of the brain, and it is in direct alignment with the visual input through the eyes and the optic nerve. If we see something that is particularly offensive, like rejection, or dangerous, like a cobra, then this sends out a signal. It is the governor of what we're going to do. Are we going to fly away? We're going to run away? We're going to stay and fight? Are we just going to freeze? What's going to happen? This is all determined by this center piece here, the part of the brain called the amygdala. The amygdala sends out, if there is something that, like rejection, that is incredibly hurtful to me, it sends out a message to my hypothalamus. My hypothalamus is the regulator of my internal hormones. It sends a message out to my kidneys, where my adrenal glands are, and they will pump out adrenaline for me to either fight or panic and scream and run away. It is the regulator. There is a whole mechanism. There is a network devoted to this in the brain. And if we don't have good executive function to put the brakes on it, our mental brakes on it, then we get the results of tantrums, outbursts, anger. All of this happens. Now, you can talk to them about it all you want. You understand what's happening, but notice that talking to them is not necessarily going to provide any change whatsoever. If the network is weak or non-existent in the brain, talk to them as you may, it is not going to change their behavior. The root of it is executive function. The root of it is being able to have good executive function, because if executive function is weak, we can't control, we can't control the behavior. We can't influence how we feel. And this first bullet is very important. We cannot change how we feel just by willing the emotion away. Won't happen. Simply willing it to go away doesn't mean that the network that puts the brakes on is going to be developed. You just can't do it that way. That's like saying, I am going to be an excellent swimmer. And you can think about it all you want, but until you get in the water and train, that's not going to change. We can influence how we feel by modifying our thoughts and behavior. We can influence it by modifying our behavior so that we learn new patterns. We know that we have old patterns in there that are not necessarily good. Now, how do we reprogram? That's what this is all about. If change is to happen, we have to reprogram the computer, our brain. And that's why I developed Play Attention, because Play Attention uses neurotech. And neurotech gives you direct access to what's happening in the brain in real time. And I thought, this is the most fantastic invention because there is no user manual for the brain. But if I can see what's happening in real time, it empowers me to make change, internal change to the actual computer itself. I can readjust. Is everyone following? Does that make sense? Thank you. All right. Just trying to make certain that we're all on the same page. We want to be able to understand the systems that run our lives. We want to understand how they work, and then how can we alter them, right? So emotion regulation, which is a part of executive function, right, helps us decrease the magnitude of these emotions. So it's a way to slow the roll down. So when the amygdala gets activated, the frontal lobes come into play, and they help us regulate ourselves so that we're taking a little bit more time to make a good call, to plan out what we're going to do, to manage it. So there's a connection between the amygdala and the frontal lobes. We can slow that roll down. We have to activate that circuit. We have to program that circuit. We have to teach ourselves how to do that. Now, can we? You bet we can. The human brain is so amazing in that it will reprogram if you provide it the right stimulation. All right. This is incredibly important to realize that we have control over this. If we don't control it, then we have emotional dysregulation. And if you've ever been around an event like this in the grocery store, where she's not going to get what she wants, and then the mechanism for being able to accept that from mom or dad is not there, then you're going to get this outcome. And then everyone's looking at you like, what is the problem with this child? I wish you would discipline her more, internally going, you're just not disciplining her enough. That's not it at all. This child just does not have the mechanism for this control for whatever reason, but we can make changes. Emotion regulation requires a series of these cognitive skills acting as our mental brakes, right? We have to be able to, and this is all in the frontal lobes, particularly, although it's really brain wide, but we'll say the frontal lobes help us understand what's going on. So we're processing this frightening rejection that we may feel. And then we pay enough attention to it to stay calm and focused. It's called equanimity, right? Being equanimous means that I am, even in the face of duress, I am able to stay level and focused. Planning, thinking through the consequences of each possible response. Mental flexibility, follow through with action and being able to change if the events change just a little bit. That's mental flexibility. Impulse control. So I am regulating my response to what's going to happen and not impulsively lashing out. This is all taking place in the frontal lobes. Matter of fact, these are all so incredibly important. But remember what we said previously. If my brain is underdeveloped, or for some reason I was not endowed with these skills, because we're not all endowed with these skills. We think that we are, and by age 25, most people will have them. Many do not. So if we don't have them, we can still build them. And let's just pick one like impulse control. How important is impulse control? Super important. How many people here are familiar with the marshmallow test? And I get a raise of hands on marshmallow test? A few of us are. Okay. You can look it up on YouTube, not now, maybe later, but the marshmallow test is significantly important. It was done, I think, originally at Stanford, and it's been repeated many times. But they would put a child in a room, and the psychologist had a secret camera on them. Child would be filmed, and they'd leave them with a marshmallow. And they would say, if you do not eat this marshmallow, I will bring you back a second one when I come back shortly. And so those that could self-regulate, especially their impulse to pick the marshmallow up and stuff it in their mouths, when they could regulate that, they followed them for many years, 30, 40, 50 years. Those that could regulate had higher paying jobs. They were more successful in life. They actually went through the educational system far better than their peers who had no impulse control, who generally dropped out of school, made less money, had significantly worse lives. And this all just from looking at one piece of executive function, impulse control. Right? And if you watch those videos, they're hysterical. The strategies kids would use to not eat the marshmallow by looking away, not looking at the marshmallow, tapping their fingers to give their mind something else to do instead of picking up the marshmallow. And then you have the impulsive kids that just looked at it, went, popped it in their mouth. And you know the outcome is not good for them. And that's just but one executive function. So these emotions can often override executive function or the weak executive function. If we don't have that skill built, it will override it. How do we get diagnosed with RSD? Well, this is a good question. Since it's new and there's limited scientific data on it, it's very difficult to find someone who could diagnose you as having RSD. And it's not in the diagnostic and easy for me to say, statistical manual of mental disorders. It's not there. So it does not have a formal diagnosis. So the likelihood of you being diagnosed with it, not likely. But could you find someone, a therapist who can identify with you on these problems and understand what executive function is? Quite likely you could. So let's talk about, in our last few minutes here, let's talk about how we reduce rejection sensitivity. We know that it is incredibly related to executive function training. Strong executive function is the brakes. It allows you to control all of your responses to stimulation like rejection. I'll give you a really good example. Everyone here probably knows who Mike Tyson is. Mike was a fearless fighter when he was in the ring. He had a coach named D'Amato, and Cus never knew what executive function was, but he knew what fear was, right? And what it did to the brain. And Cus was a real original. He said, you know, fear is like electricity. It can either bake your bread or it can burn your house down. Depends on how you use it. And what he was actually pointing to is strong executive function. So we had the brakes. We had the ability of the governor to control our executive function and make good decisions and be wise about it. But if we don't have that, the outcomes would be burning our house down, which is really what we're doing with RSD. We don't have the brakes. We go into outbursts. It causes us depression because people can't understand why you have these outbursts. And typically they could result in anger and even inflicting injury to others, which is the most serious side of it. So having strong executive function is exactly why we built Play Attention. And that is one of the reasons I'm here explaining this to you today, because this is something I realized very early on, is that ADHD, autism, RSD are all related to strong executive function. I thought if we can fix that, if we can give them techniques to see what their brain is doing in real time and therefore learn these skills, we've made huge differences. Now, when I thought about it, I'd never thought that Tufts University School of Medicine would get funding from the federal government and test it, but they did. And they found that we could teach it. We could teach executive function. As a matter of fact, they pitted us against brain games that you could buy off the internet, like Lumosity-based brain games, Calm-based brain games. And they pitted us against a group that got nothing. We had 5x improvement in executive function over those two control groups. 5x improvement in attention, and huge improvements in other areas. The significant, one of the significant findings in the study was that the two control groups either required increased medication. Well, actually, both of them required an average of 8 milligram to 13 milligram increase in medicine to stay in school. Ours either were off medication or they required no increase because the brain was changing to give them the power to put on the brakes. It was increasing their executive function. So in order to do it, you have to get to the root cause. We can't wishfully think it away, not happening. We can't just talk ourselves and pump ourselves up and give ourselves these cognitive skills. We have to learn the skills. It's just as we can equate it to learning to tie our shoe. You know, I can will myself, if I don't know how to tie a shoe, I can will myself all I want to tie a shoe, but until I learn to do it, I'm not going to tie that shoe. This is so critical and fundamental to the problem here. So here we go again. If we have to have good processing, attention, planning, mental flexibility, and control, we can learn them, but we have to actually participate and learn. And that's the unpleasant thing, right? It's not immediate. It's got to be worked on. And so there is no magic pill that you can take and all of a sudden it's all going to go away. You actually have to work to do it. That's the truth. I wanted to talk to you about time travel too. All right. I know this seems kind of silly and funny, but it's actually true. And this is also one of the problems we have as far as executive function is concerned. 1/3 of our lives are spent in the now, right? 1/3. But where are the other 2/3? Well, 1/3 is spent now, but 1/3 is spent in the past. Now we think about the past, that's where we think, and this is where depression arises. I think about the past and how much better the past was. Remember all the stories that are recorded? I record the good stories. I have some of the bad stories. If I spend time thinking about those past stories, they could cause me to be depressed. I could have great grief if I keep repeating the death of this person, the sadness associated with this person. I can get grief. I can get regret. I shouldn't have done that. I should have done this. This is all living in the past. So we time travel, whether you realized it or not. We dive into the past all the time. I have resentment and shame for things, and this is all my mind jumping in the past. Now, this is related to me and my programming and my executive function. So 1/3 is now, 1/3 is in the past, and then we're going back to the future. Future thinking. It causes me anxiety. Am I going to get that done? Am I going to be able to do it? I don't know if that's going to happen. I'm afraid of what they're going to do. Helplessness. So I don't have any control over that. So I feel helplessness. I feel hopelessness because it is out of my control. And then I worry about it. So this is how we time travel. And you can see that fundamentally, not necessarily a good thing. What about just staying in the moment now? This is called mindfulness training, which is fundamentally incredibly healthy. This is Eckhart Tolle. Realize deeply that the moment is all you have, the present moment. If you make now your primary focus of life, then you're developing good executive function. But reality is that when you are in the now, and many of you have been in the now for a good long time, you've been with me almost an hour, and you've been in the now. But during that time, how many times has your mind wandered? How many times have you picked up your cell phone to examine your email? How many times have you watched something flash up on the screen? How much quality time do we have right now? Because even though we said that 1/3 is spent now, that time is not quality time. It's not really spent now. That time is spent entertaining ourselves. That time is spent distracted. And so if we wonder why our relationships are falling apart, we have to examine a little bit about mindfulness, being in the moment, which is deeply rooted, deeply related to executive function. We have games, by the way, in Play Attention that are fantastic for mindfulness, to actually see your mind in real time. One is called Da Vinci's Candle. There's a video up on it on YouTube. It's amazing. This is exactly why we develop Play Attention, to teach you all of these skills. And by the way, if you don't know which particular executive functions are problems for you or your child or your client, there is an ADHD test on the playattention.com website. It's free. Just take it. And when you get through with it, you're going to find out especially what of these particular executive functions are weakest for you, or need strengthening, or need to be developed flat out. And we use this neurotech that does it so that you can actually see what's happening in your mind in real time. This fits on your arm, and then we use the impulses to allow you to control the computer screen by mind alone. Therapy. Therapy will not totally fix it, but it is good to be able to talk your problems through and learn strategies to be able to cope with certain things. They can discuss these things with you, but you must learn them, and you have to have a way to practice them. Stress control, there's mindfulness, meditation, Tai Chi, yoga. There are many ways to do that, but you have to have regular practice, and you have to have a benchmark where you understand this particular skill that you need is getting developed in executive function. Play Attention has all these mindfulness activities, even motor skill activities like moving Tai Chi, that kind of thing. Now, there are medicines, particularly medicines for depression, that are used, and even blood pressure medicines like clonidine, things like that, are prescribed for it, what they call off-label. They're not particularly meant for RSD, because RSD is not even in the diagnostic statistical manual, but they are sometimes prescribed for those. So medicine is also an alternative, but will that medicine teach you the skills? No. Remember, it's a Band-Aid. When to seek emergency care. Remember, I talked about 988. I'm going to talk about it in and up here now. If at all you are ideating about injuring yourself, call the prevention hotline. This is good. One of the folks here said it's good for, both Canada and the United States. Let's summarize. Remember, RSD may be genetic, but the cause is not fully understood. We just don't fully understand it, but we do know it is highly related to executive function. An ADHD brain, because of the way it is wired, often amplifies or intensifies one's emotions. Autism, you could say the same. Rejection can cause overpowering emotions that sometimes present as anger or wild outbursts. Rejection may cause destructive thought patterns if one doesn't manage them correctly. That's related again to executive function. Executive function is a group of mental skills that help us regulate our emotions. If they are weak because of one's brain development, then we have to strengthen them. Can they be strengthened? Can everyone reply to that? Can we strengthen executive function? Is that a yes or a no? Absolutely. That's correct. We can. Absolutely. You can rewire this computer. There is no user manual for it, but you can rewire it. All right. We do have strategies to do it. That's what we do at Play Attention. Remember, you can take the online ADHD test at playattention.com. It's free. You'll get a list of things that you're concerned about so that you have a better understanding of yourself and your RSD, your ADHD, your autism, and so forth. There is going to be a Play Attention webinar on April 27th. I just want to thank everyone for being here and staying with me. It's been a full hour. And nowadays, listening to anything for a full hour is highly taxing for our attention spans, as our cognitive faculties and our executive function is pretty weak. But I am happy that you were here. I'm happy to have talked to you. And I really appreciate you sharing your time.